My name is Marcus, and for 37 years, I've been what you'd call a simple man with simple pleasures. I work in IT for a mid-sized company, I drive a reliable Honda Civic, and my idea of a perfect evening is casting a line into the water as the sun sets behind the trees. But when HOA President Karen Whitfield decided to fine me $300 for disturbing the peace by fishing at night on my own property, she had no idea she was about to wake up a sleeping giant. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I didn't just live on the lake. I owned it, and I was about to teach her and the entire Lakeside Estates HOA what happens when you mess with the wrong fisherman. But before I tell you how I brought down the most tyrannical HOA president in our neighborhood's history, I need you to understand something. Drop a comment below and let me know, have you ever had that moment where someone pushed you so far that you had to make a choice between rolling over or fighting back? Because that's exactly what happened to me, and I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous. Let me paint you a picture of who I was before all this started. I inherited my lakefront property from my grandfather, Thomas Chun, when I was 25. Grandpa Tom had bought the land back in 1987 when it was just wilderness and a pristine natural lake. He was a veteran, a man who valued peace and solitude, and he spent his final years building a modest cabin where he could fish and watch the seasons change. When he passed, he left me not just the property, but a legacy of quiet strength and a deep respect for the natural world. The house isn't much to look at from the street. A simple two-story colonial with weathered siding and a front porch that's seen better days. But walk around back, and you'll find paradise. My property stretches down a gentle slope to the water's edge, where a private dock extends into the lake. Ancient oak trees provide shade in the summer, and in the fall, their leaves create a golden carpet that crunches under your feet. The lake itself is about 60 acres, fed by an underground spring that keeps the water crystal clear year-round. Bass, bluegill, and the occasional northern pike call it home. And on quiet mornings, you can see deer coming down to drink at the water's edge. This wasn't just my home, it was my sanctuary. After my divorce 3 years ago, when Sarah took half of everything and moved to California with our daughter Emma, the lake became my therapist. Every evening after work, I'd grab my tackle box and my grandfather's old fishing rod, walk down to the dock, and cast my worries into the water. The gentle lapping of waves against the wooden posts, the distant call of a loon, the satisfying arc of a line cutting through the still air. These sounds were my meditation, my connection to something bigger than quarterly reports and failed relationships. I particularly love night fishing. There's something magical about being on the water when the rest of the world is asleep. The fish are more active, the air is cooler, and the silence is so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. I'd set up my folding chair on the dock, crack open a beer, and watch the moon's reflection dance on the water's surface. Sometimes I'd catch something, sometimes I wouldn't, but that wasn't really the point. The point was peace. That peace lasted for 12 beautiful years, until Lakeside Estates started sprouting up around me like mushrooms after rain. The development began in 2019 when a company called Sunrise Properties bought the surrounding land and started building what they called luxury lakefront living. Within 2 years, my quiet sanctuary was surrounded by McMansions with manicured lawns and 3-car garages. The new residents were mostly wealthy professionals from the city, doctors, lawyers, executives, people who saw the lake as a scenic backdrop for their Instagram photos rather than a living ecosystem to be respected. At first, I tried to be neighborly. I waved when they jogged past my property. I didn't complain when their landscaping trucks blocked my driveway, and I even helped when one of them had a flat tire on the narrow access road. But it quickly became clear that they saw me as an oddity, a relic from a simpler time who didn't belong in their vision of suburban perfection. The complaints started small. Someone called the county about my unkempt yard because I let wildflowers grow instead of maintaining a perfect lawn. Another neighbor suggested I should upgrade my dock to match the sleek composite structures they were installing. But I held my ground. This was my grandfather's land, and I was going to honor his memory by keeping it natural and peaceful. Then came the HOA. Karen Whitfield moved into the largest house in the development in early 2023. a sprawling contemporary monstrosity with floor-to-ceiling windows and a lawn so perfect it looked like artificial turf. She was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd pay $2 million for a house just to control everyone around her. Mid-50s, blonde hair that never moved in the wind, and the kind of smile that looked like it had been practiced in a mirror. She drove a white BMW SUV with vanity plates that read "Boss Lady," and had a voice that could cut glass when she was displeased. Within 3 months of moving in, Karen had organized a neighborhood into an official HOA, complete with bylaws, architectural guidelines, and monthly fees. She positioned herself as the natural choice for president, arguing that her background in corporate management made her uniquely qualified to maintain property values and community standards. The other residents, mostly busy professionals who just wanted someone else to handle the details, voted her in without much thought. That's when my problems began. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday evening in June. I was on my dock, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, when I heard the sharp click of high heels on the gravel path leading to my backyard. I turned to see Karen approaching, tablet in hand, her expression already set in what I'd come to recognize as her official business face. "Mr. Chun," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they think they're being reasonable but are actually being condescending. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." I set down my fishing rod and stood up, trying to keep my voice friendly. "Not at all, Karen. What can I do for you?" She tapped her tablet screen and launched into what was clearly a prepared speech. "As you know, the Lakeside Estates HOA has been working hard to establish community standards that protect all of our property values. We've had some concerns raised about certain activities that might not be in keeping with our neighborhood's character." I felt my stomach tighten, but I kept my expression neutral. "What kind of activities?" "Well," she said, gesturing toward my dock, "there have been reports of fishing activities taking place at inappropriate hours. Late evening fishing, specifically. Some residents have expressed concern about the noise and disruption to the peaceful enjoyment of their properties." I stared at her for a moment, trying to process what she'd just said. "You're talking about me fishing from my own dock?" "The lake is a shared community resource," she replied, her smile never wavering. "While I understand you have riparian rights as a lakefront property owner, we need to balance individual freedoms with community harmony. We're implementing quiet hours from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., which means no fishing, no boat motors, and no other activities that might disturb the peace." The absurdity of it hit me like a physical blow. "Karen, I've been fishing this lake for 12 years. I've never once had a complaint about noise. I use a fishing rod, not a motorboat. The only sound I make is the occasional splash when I catch something." Her expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Chun, I understand this might be an adjustment for you, but rules are rules. The HOA has voted, and the decision is final. I'm sure you can find plenty of opportunities to fish during daylight hours." I felt my grandfather's voice in my head, reminding me to stay calm, to pick my battles wisely. "Karen, with all due respect, I don't think the HOA has any authority over how I use my own property. I'm not violating any county ordinances or state laws." "Actually," she said, pulling up something on her tablet, "you might be surprised to learn that your property is subject to the same community standards as everyone else's. When you bought here, you agreed to maintain the character of the neighborhood. Disruptive activities that lower property values can be addressed through our enforcement procedures." I wanted to point out that I'd bought my property 15 years before her neighborhood even existed, but something in her tone told me this conversation was heading nowhere good. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Simply follow the quiet hours policy like everyone else. No fishing after 8 p.m. It's really not that complicated." She tapped her tablet again. "Consider this your official notice. Any violations will result in fines and potential legal action." After she left, I sat on my dock for a long time, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. The lake was perfectly still, the only sounds the gentle lapping of water and the distant call of a night bird. This was the time I treasured most, when the world felt infinite and peaceful. And now Karen Whitfield wanted to take that away from me. I decided to do some research. That night, I pulled out my property deed and read through every line of the purchase agreement. I studied the HOA bylaws that Karen had cited, looking for any legal basis for her claim over my property. What I found was troubling, but not surprising. The HOA documents were filled with vague language about community standards and property values, but they were light on specifics about enforcement and even lighter on the actual legal authority behind their rules. More importantly, I discovered something Karen apparently didn't know. My property deed predated the HOA by 15 years. I wasn't bound by agreements I'd never signed, and my grandfathered rights as the original lakefront property owner gave me protections that the newer residents didn't have. But I also realized that Karen wasn't the type to back down just because she was legally wrong. She had the resources to make my life miserable through constant complaints, frivolous lawsuits, and social pressure. I'd seen what happened to people who crossed HOA boards. Years of harassment, legal bills, and neighborhood ostracism. Maybe it was easier to just comply, to find new ways to enjoy my property that didn't involve evening fishing. So I tried to be reasonable. For the next month, I adjusted my schedule. I'd rush home from work, grab my gear, and try to get an hour of fishing in before the 8 p.m. cutoff. It wasn't the same. The fish were less active in the bright daylight. The tranquility was shattered by lawnmowers and construction noise from the ongoing development, and I lost that magical transition from day to night that had always been my favorite part of the experience. I thought Karen would be satisfied. I was following her rules, staying within her arbitrary boundaries, proving that I could be a good neighbor. But I should have known better. People like Karen don't want compliance. They want submission. And my willingness to compromise only convinced her that she had more power than she actually did. The escalation began on a Friday evening in August. I was on my dock at 7:30 p.m., trying to squeeze in 30 minutes of fishing before the cutoff, when I heard a commotion from the direction of Karen's house. Loud voices, car doors slamming, and then the sound of multiple people walking toward the lake. I looked up to see Karen leading a group of about 8 neighbors down the path to the water's edge. They were all holding phones, clearly recording, and Karen was speaking loudly enough for me to hear every word. As you can see, she was saying, "This is exactly the kind of disruptive behavior we've been trying to address." While the rest of us are trying to enjoy a peaceful evening, some residents feel entitled to disturb the entire community with their recreational activities. I felt my face burn with embarrassment and anger. I was sitting quietly on my own dock, bothering no one, and she was treating me like a criminal. But I kept my voice calm when I called out, "Karen, it's 7:30. Your quiet hours don't start until 8. The spirit of the rule is about community consideration," she replied, her voice carrying across the water. "Just because you're technically within the time limit doesn't mean you should be pushing the boundaries." One of the neighbors, a man I didn't recognize, chimed in. "Can't you fish during normal hours like everyone else?" "This is normal hours," I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. "And this is my property." Karen seized on that. "See, this is exactly the attitude that's causing problems. My property, my rules. Well, we all live here, and we all have to compromise for the greater good." I reeled to my line and started packing up my gear. There was no point in trying to fish with an audience of hostile neighbors recording my every move. As I walked back toward my house, I heard Karen's voice continuing behind me. "This is what we're dealing with, everyone. Someone who thinks their personal hobbies are more important than community harmony. But don't worry, we have tools to address this kind of behavior." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the humiliation, the way Karen had turned my peaceful evening into a spectacle, the fact that my own neighbors were now seeing me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. I tried to be reasonable, to follow their rules, and all it had gotten me was public shaming and threats of further action. The next morning, I found a certified letter in my mailbox. It was from the HOA, signed by Karen, and it contained a formal violation notice. According to the letter, I was being fined $150 for disruptive behavior and failure to maintain community standards. The specific violation was listed as fishing activities that disturb the peaceful enjoyment of neighboring properties. I read the letter 3 times, trying to understand how fishing quietly on my own property could possibly be considered disruptive. The fine was due within 30 days, and failure to pay would result in additional penalties and potential legal action. That's when I realized Karen wasn't interested in reasonable compromise. She was interested in control. She wanted to own not just her property, but everyone else's too. She wanted to be able to dictate how I used my own land, how I spent my evenings, and how I honored my grandfather's memory. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. That Saturday, I drove to the county courthouse and pulled the original land records for my property. What I found there changed everything. You see, when my grandfather bought his land in 1987, he didn't just buy the house and the immediate property around it. He bought something much more valuable, the lake itself. The deed was clear. Thomas Chun had purchased not just the 60-acre lake, but the mineral rights, water rights, and riparian rights that came with it. The lake wasn't community property. It was private property. My property. The HOA had no more authority over my lake than they had over my living room. But there was more. The deed also included something called recreational easements that my grandfather had granted to the county. These easements allowed public access to the lake for fishing and non-motorized boating, but they came with a crucial caveat. They could be revoked at any time by the property owner with 30 days' notice. I sat in my car outside the courthouse, staring at the documents spread across my passenger seat, feeling a slow smile spread across my face. Karen thought she was dealing with just another homeowner who could be bullied into submission. She had no idea that she'd just declared war on the guy who owned the very lake that made her luxury lakefront living possible. But I wasn't going to rush into anything. Karen had made the mistake of underestimating me, and I wasn't going to make the same mistake with her. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with and plan my response carefully. I spent the next week researching everything I could find about Karen Whitfield and the HOA. I discovered that she'd been involved in similar conflicts in her previous neighborhood, a gated community in the city where she'd served as vice president of their HOA. According to online forums and local news articles, she'd been part of a group that had successfully sued 3 different homeowners for violations ranging from inappropriate mailbox colors to excessive garden decorations. She was experienced, well-connected, and she knew how to use legal pressure to get her way. I also learned that she wasn't just the HOA president. She was the driving force behind most of their policies. The other board members were busy professionals who relied on her to handle the day-to-day management, which meant she had essentially unlimited power to interpret and enforce the rules as she saw fit. But most importantly, I discovered that Karen had been telling people I was a problem resident who was bringing down property values with my unkempt property and disruptive activities. She'd been building a case against me for months, documenting every interaction, every complaint, every perceived violation. She wasn't just trying to stop me from fishing. She was trying to force me out of the neighborhood entirely. That's when I knew I had to act. I started by consulting with a property lawyer named David Martinez, who specialized in HOA disputes and property rights. When I showed him my grandfather's deed and explained the situation, his eyes lit up like he'd just won the lottery. "This is extraordinary," he said, spreading the documents across his desk. "Your grandfather was incredibly smart. He bought the lake before any of this development existed, which means your property rights supersede any HOA agreements. And these recreational easements, they're revocable at your discretion. Do you realize what this means?" I had a pretty good idea, but I wanted to hear him say it. "It means you don't just live on the lake, Mr. Chun. You own it. And if you wanted to, you could revoke public access tomorrow. Every single one of those lakefront properties would lose their lake access, their boat docks, their swimming areas, everything that makes them valuable." David helped me understand the full scope of my rights. As the lake owner, I had the authority to control all recreational activities on the water. I could grant or deny access to specific individuals or groups. I could establish my own rules about fishing, boating, and swimming. I could even charge fees for access if I wanted to. But more importantly, I could revoke the HOA's assumed authority over community lake resources because there was no such thing. The lake was private property, and Karen's rules about quiet hours and fishing restrictions had no legal basis whatsoever. "What would you recommend?" I asked him. David smiled. "That depends on what you want to accomplish. Do you want to just protect your fishing rights? Or do you want to send a message that you won't be pushed around? I thought about Karen's smug face when she'd served me with a violation notice. I thought about the humiliation of being publicly shamed for quietly fishing on my own property. I thought about my grandfather, who'd spent his life defending freedom and would have been disgusted by Karen's petty tyranny. I want to send a message, I said. We spent the next hour developing a strategy. David would draft a formal response to the HOA violation notice, explaining that their rules had no legal authority over my property and that their fine was invalid. But that was just the opening move. The real power play would come later, when Karen inevitably escalated the conflict and gave me justification for more dramatic action. The key, David explained, is to let them make the first aggressive move. You need to be able to show that you tried to resolve this reasonably, but they forced your hand. HOA disputes are often about public perception as much as legal rights. I left David's office feeling more confident than I had in months. But I also knew that Karen wouldn't back down easily. She'd built her identity around being in control, and my legal response would be seen as a direct challenge to her authority. Things were about to get much worse before they got better. I was right. The HOA's response to my lawyer's letter was swift and brutal. Within 3 days, I received a new violation notice, this time for failure to maintain property appearance standards. According to Karen, my dock was weathered and unsightly. My lawn contained excessive weeds and unauthorized plant growth, and my house needed immediate exterior maintenance to comply with architectural guidelines. The fine was $500 due immediately, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened next. That Friday evening, I came home from work to find a notice of violation sign planted in my front yard. It was about 2 feet tall, with bright red lettering that could be seen from the street, and it listed my violations for everyone to see. Failure to maintain property standards, disruptive recreational activities, and non-compliance with community regulations. I stood on my front porch, staring at that sign, feeling a rage building inside me that I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just about fishing anymore. This was about respect, dignity, and the right to live peacefully on my own property. Karen had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I called David immediately. "Can she do this?" I asked him. "Can she put a violation sign on my property?" "Check your deed," he said. "Does the HOA have any easements or rights to your front yard?" I pulled out the property documents. "No, the only easements are for utilities and the lake access." "Then she's trespassing," David said, "and she's also engaging in what could be considered harassment and public defamation." This is exactly the kind of escalation we were hoping for. That night, I took photographs of the sign from every angle. I documented the trespassing, the public shaming, the complete lack of legal authority for Karen's actions. And then I sat on my dock, watching the moonlight dance on the water, and made a decision that would change everything. It was time to show Karen Whitfield what real power looked like. The next morning, I called the county clerk's office and began the process of revoking the recreational easements on my lake. It was surprisingly simple, just a matter of filing the proper paperwork and paying a small fee. The county clerk, a friendly woman named Margaret, explained that I need to provide 30 days' notice to all affected parties and post signs around the lake boundary. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "This is going to affect a lot of people." "I'm sure," I said. "It's my property, and I have the right to control access." Next, I contacted a sign company and ordered a dozen professional grade signs that read, "Private property, no trespassing, lake access revoked by owner. Violators will be prosecuted." The signs were scheduled to be installed the following Monday. But I wasn't done yet. I also hired a property management company to conduct a formal survey of my land boundaries. What they found was interesting. 3 of the HOA's newer docks had been built on my property without permission. They were technically trespassing structures that I could have removed at any time. David helped me draft a series of legal notices. The first went to the HOA board, formally notifying them that their authority over my property was null and void, and that any future harassment would be met with legal action. The second went to the county, officially revoking the recreational easements and establishing my lake as private property with restricted access. The third notice was my masterpiece. It was a personal letter to Karen Whitfield, sent via certified mail that explained exactly what was about to happen and why. "Dear Ms. Whitfield," it began, "you have repeatedly harassed me for fishing on my own property, fined me for violations that have no legal basis, and trespassed on my land to post defamatory signs. You have shown complete disregard for my property rights and personal dignity. Therefore, effective 30 days from the date of this letter, I am revoking all recreational access to my lake. This includes fishing, boating, swimming, and any other activities. Your assumed authority over community lake resources is hereby terminated, as there are no community lake resources, only private property that you have taken for granted." I ended the letter with a line that I knew would haunt her. "You wanted to control how I use my property. Now you'll learn what it feels like when someone else controls access to yours." The signs went up on Monday morning. By Tuesday, my phone was ringing nonstop. Angry neighbors, confused HOA board members, and an increasingly frantic Karen Whitfield all wanted to know what was happening and how to stop it. I let them all go to voicemail. On Wednesday, Karen showed up at my door with 2 other board members in tow. I watched through my window as she pounded on my front door, her face red with anger, her voice carrying across the neighborhood as she demanded that I stop this nonsense immediately. I didn't answer the door. On Thursday, I received a threatening letter from the HOA's lawyer, claiming that my actions were illegal and destructive to the community. They demanded that I restore lake access immediately or face a lawsuit. David responded within hours, sending them copies of my property deed and a detailed explanation of my legal rights. He also included a warning that any further harassment would result in counter-litigation for trespassing, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. By Friday, the local news had picked up the story. A reporter called me, asking for comment on the lake access dispute in Lakeside Estates. I gave her a simple statement. I am exercising my legal rights as a property owner to control access to my private lake. This action was taken in response to months of harassment from the HOA for fishing on my own property. The story aired that evening, and suddenly my phone was ringing with calls from people all over the city. Some were supportive, calling me a hero for standing up to HOA tyranny. Others were critical, saying I was being selfish and destructive to the community. I didn't care about either group. The only opinion that mattered was Karen's, and I could see from her increasingly desperate actions that she was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what she'd unleashed. The weekend brought the first real consequences. Without lake access, the residents of Lakeside Estates suddenly found themselves trapped in expensive homes with no access to the water that had made them valuable. The beautiful docks became useless decorations. The lakefront views were still there, but they might as well have been looking at a museum exhibit behind glass. Property values began to plummet immediately. By Monday, 3 houses had been put up for sale, and others were inquiring about breaking their lease agreements. The local real estate market was buzzing with speculation about how long the lake ban would last and whether it would become permanent. Karen's response was predictable. She tried to rally the neighborhood against me. She organized meetings, sent out emails, and even started a petition demanding that the county force me to restore lake access. But her efforts were undermined by a simple fact. I wasn't doing anything illegal or unreasonable. I was a property owner exercising my legal rights, and no amount of community pressure could change that. More importantly, the other residents were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about how the HOA had handled the situation. Why had Karen picked a fight with the lake owner? Why hadn't she researched the property rights before implementing rules about lake usage? Why had she escalated a simple dispute into a crisis that was destroying everyone's property values? The breaking point came 2 weeks later at what would be Karen's final HOA board meeting as president. I didn't attend the meeting, but I heard about it from multiple sources. According to witnesses, Karen was increasingly frantic, insisting that the board needed to find a way to force me to restore lake access. She talked about eminent domain, about environmental lawsuits, about anything that might give her back the control she'd lost. But the other board members were done listening to her. They'd received dozens of complaints from residents who were furious about the plummeting property values. They've been contacted by lawyers representing people who wanted to sue the HOA for creating the crisis. They'd watched their own home values evaporate because of Karen's vendetta against a quiet fisherman. The motion to remove Karen as president passed by a vote of 4-1, with only Karen herself dissenting. The motion to formally apologize to me and attempt to negotiate a resolution passed by the same margin. The next morning, I received a call from a new HOA president, a soft-spoken accountant named Robert Mills. He was polite, respectful, and clearly embarrassed by his predecessor's actions. "Mr. Chun," he said, "I want to start by apologizing for how you've been treated. The board has reviewed the situation, and we understand that you are completely within your rights to fish on your own property. We also understand that our previous president exceeded her authority in attempting to regulate your activities." I listened politely as he continued. "We're hoping we can find a way to resolve this that works for everyone. We understand that you own the lake, and we respect your property rights. But we also hope you'll consider the impact on the entire community. Is there any way we might discuss terms for restoring lake access?" I had been waiting for this call for weeks, and I'd thought carefully about how to respond. Karen had taught me that power without mercy was tyranny, but I'd also learned that mercy without power was weakness. I needed to find a middle ground that would protect my rights while showing that I wasn't the villain in this story. "I'm willing to consider it," I told Robert, "but any agreement would have to include several non-negotiable terms." "Of course," he said. "What would those be?" "First, a formal written apology from the HOA for the harassment and illegal fines. Second, reimbursement for all legal fees I've incurred. Third, a written acknowledgement that the HOA has no authority over my property or my recreational activities. And fourth, Karen Whitfield is permanently banned from any leadership position in the HOA." "I think we can work with that," Robert said. "What about the lake access?" "I'll restore the recreational easements," I said, "but with new conditions. The lake will be open to all residents for fishing, swimming, and non-motorized boating. But there will be no quiet hours, no restrictions on fishing times, and no regulations about what constitutes appropriate recreational activities. The lake will operate under simple rules: respect the environment, respect other users, and respect the property owner." "That sounds very reasonable," Robert said. "I think the board will approve those terms." 3 days later, I received a formal letter from the HOA board, signed by all 5 members. It contained everything I'd asked for: a detailed apology, acknowledgement of my property rights, reimbursement for my legal fees, and confirmation that Karen had been permanently barred from any leadership role. The letter also included something I hadn't expected: a thank you note from the residents. Despite the temporary disruption to lake access, many of them had come to appreciate what I'd done. I'd shown them that HOA boards weren't all-powerful, that property rights mattered, and that sometimes the only way to deal with a bully was to stand up and fight back. I signed the agreement and restored lake access the following week. But I also kept the legal documents that proved my ownership, and I made sure everyone in the neighborhood understood that the lake was private property that was being shared as a courtesy, not a right. Karen, meanwhile, had quietly put her house up for sale. According to the neighborhood gossip, she'd accepted a job in another state and would be moving within a month. She never spoke to me again, never acknowledged what had happened, and never apologized for the months of harassment and humiliation she'd put me through. But I didn't need her apology. I had something much more valuable: the knowledge that I'd stood up for myself, protected my grandfather's legacy, and shown an entire community that sometimes the quiet ones have the loudest voices of all. The lake is peaceful again now. I fish whenever I want, day or night, and no one bothers me about noise or disruption. The other residents have learned to appreciate the privilege of lake access, and they treat the water with the respect it deserves. Children play on the docks, families have picnics on the shore, and the evening sunsets are as beautiful as ever. Sometimes, when I'm sitting on my dock at twilight, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky, I think about the lesson Karen taught me. She thought that power came from rules and regulations, from the ability to control and intimidate others. But real power comes from something much simpler: knowing who you are, standing up for what's right, and never letting anyone convince you that you're powerless. I still have my grandfather's fishing rod, and I still use it every evening. But now, when I cast my line into the water, I'm not just fishing for bass or bluegill. I'm fishing for peace, for justice, and for the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that sometimes the good guys really do win. So here's my question for you. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have backed down when Karen started her harassment campaign, or would you have fought back? Have you ever had to deal with someone who thought they could push you around just because they had a little authority? Let me know in the comments below, because I've got more stories about standing up to neighborhood bullies, and I want to hear your thoughts on how to handle people who think they can control everyone around them. And if you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because the next time someone tries to mess with the wrong person, I'll be here to tell you exactly how it went down.